Welcome to episode 2 of The Gray Files, where we peel back the layers of technology, economics, data science, and the human condition itself, all in an effort to decode the vast and often perplexing system we call modern civilization. I'm your host, Erica Barker, and if you joined us for episode 1, you already know the mission. We're here to step back, widen the frame, and examine the shifting tectonic plates beneath our social, economic, and political landscapes. If this is your first time listening, welcome. This is not a place for easy answers or pre-packaged ideologies. We live in the gray, the murky middle ground where truth resists simplification and nuance is often more revealing than certainty. Last time we explored the ways political tensions ripple through our personal lives, fracturing friendships, straining families, and reshaping communities. We looked at history through a panoramic lens, tracing the rise and fall of societies, the power struggles that drive them, and the cyclical nature of human affairs. We confronted an unsettling reality. What feels stable today can unravel with astonishing speed. Now, in episode 2, we turn the same forensic gaze onto the middle class, the so called backbone of American democracy. But what happens when that backbone begins to weaken? Why have key economic indicators like the velocity of money and relative middle class household income been quietly slipping downward? These aren't just dry statistics buried in an economic textbook somewhere. They are signals, canaries in the coal mine, whispering warnings about the deeper structural shifts shaping our collective future. The question isn't just what is happening, it's why. And more importantly, where does this road lead? A thriving middle class has long been the gravitational anchor of American democracy, stabilizing political institutions and fueling economic dynamism. It is no coincidence that when this economic cohort is strong, societies enjoy relative stability, innovation flourishes, and a democratic experiment moves forward. But when the middle class weakens, when its financial pulse slows, and its purchasing power erodes, the consequences ripple far beyond individual households. The very scaffolding of democratic governance starts to creak under the weight of economic imbalance. And these two key indicators, the velocity of money and relative middle class household income, or RMHI, which we discussed in episode 1, serves as a barometer of this shift. Both have been on a steady downward trajectory in the United States and much of the developed world, flashing unmistakable warnings about concentrated wealth, stagnating wages, and the potential transformation of governance itself. If history has taught us anything, it's that economic distortions don't just create financial hardship, they reshape entire civilizations. Part 1: The Velocity of Money, the Economy's Circulatory System. If money is the lifeblood of an economy, then its velocity, the rate at which it moves through businesses, households, and communities, is akin to the circulatory system of the human body. When blood flows freely, the body thrives, but when circulation slows, organs falter, systems fail, and the risk of collapse rises. Likewise, a high velocity of money signals a vibrant economy, one where dollars move efficiently through the hands of consumers and businesses, creating widespread prosperity. A declining velocity, however, is a red flag, a sign that money is stagnating in fewer hands and that inequality is rising and that economic dynamism is faltering. For much of the 20th century, the US economy enjoyed a healthy, robust money velocity, reinforcing its status as the world's economic powerhouse. But since July 1997, this vital indicator has been in a near continuous decline. The velocity of money has fallen by 38% since July of 1997. This translates to an annual decline of 1.69% per year. So, what does this really mean? Well, beneath the surface, this decline tells us a story of shifting economic structures, one where wealth is increasingly concentrated at the top. Productive industry is overshadowed by financial markets, and consumer spending, once the engine of the economy, is losing momentum. Economists calculate money velocity by dividing nominal GDP by the money supply, essentially measuring how often each dollar is spent within a given year. In a thriving economy, money changes hands frequently, powering businesses, creating jobs, and sustaining demand. But in recent decades, wealth has become so disproportionately concentrated that large portions of capital now sit idle in financial markets rather than fueling broad based economic activity. The ultra wealthy, after all, don't spend incremental income at the same rate as middle and lower income households. When money pools at the top, it exits the real economy and enters the realm of asset accumulation, stocks, bonds, real estate, where it circulates far less efficiently. This imbalance marks a profound shift. Financialization has eclipsed production, and wealth accumulation has drifted away from the lived economic experience of the vast majority of Americans. This is not just an economic trend, it is a fundamental transformation, one that carries seismic implications for democracy itself. Part 2: Structural Forces Behind the Decline in Money Velocity. Civilizations are not built on wealth alone. They are built on movement, of ideas, of ambition, and crucially, of money. When currency flows freely, economies hum with energy, innovation flourishes, and societies expand their horizons. But when the flow slows, when money pools in stagnant reservoirs rather than coursing through the economic bloodstream, the results are as predictable as they are devastating: stagnation, inequality, and a creeping paralysis that chokes the very institutions meant to sustain a thriving democracy. In the United States, the decline in the velocity of money is not just an economic anomaly. It is a profound signal that something fundamental has changed. So let's now unravel the structural shifts responsible for this slowdown. Number one, the death of pensions and the rise of hoarded wealth. Once upon a time, a stable middle class worker could count on defined benefit pension, a promise that retirement meant security. With a guaranteed income, retirees remained active economic participants, knowing that their money was meant to be spent, not hoarded. Then came the rise of 401ks and self funded retirement plans, shifting the burden of financial security from institutions to individuals. The result? A psychological shift towards saving over spending, with vast sums of money now locked away in investment accounts rather than flowing through businesses, wages, and local economies. The paradox is clear: the more people feel the need to safeguard their futures, the less they contribute to the economic present. Number two, quantitative easing, a lifeline for markets, a noose for the middle class. In the wake of an economic crisis, the Federal Reserve turned to quantitative easing, or QE. as a financial defibrillator, pumping trillions into the system, stabilizing markets, and keeping credit lines open. The problem, you ask? Well, this monetary intervention disproportionately benefited those who already owned assets, stocks, real estate, corporate bonds, while doing little to stimulate the everyday economy of wages, small businesses, and household spending. QE inflated stock prices, supercharged corporate profits, and rewarded financial speculation. But did it increase money velocity? Hardly. It made the rich richer, leaving the middle class staring at a world where their wages remained stagnant while the cost of living climbed even higher. Number three, globalization and the hollowing out of the middle class jobs. For decades, globalization was framed as a rising tide that would lift all boats. What was left unsaid was that many of those boats, particularly in manufacturing heavy economies, were deliberately sunk. With the outsourcing of middle class jobs to low wage nations, corporate profits soared while wage growth stagnated. The result? Millions of American workers, once central to the country's economic engine, were left with declining purchasing power, spending less, saving more, and tightening their grip on every dollar. Money that once flowed freely now slowed as everyday workers found themselves fighting just to stay afloat. Number four, Wall Street's rise and the financialization of everything. The United States economy was once driven by production, industry, and broad based prosperity. Today, it's dominated by something else entirely: financialization, the art of making money off money. Rather than reinvesting profits into higher wages, research, or expansion, corporations now engage in stock buybacks, speculative trading, and high frequency financial wizardry designed to maximize shareholder value rather than long term economic stability. The irony? The more capital that's poured into financial markets, the less that actually circulates in the real economy. Money velocity declines not because there's less money, but because it is locked away in places where it serves no productive function. Number five, economic uncertainty and the psychology of hoarding. Ask the average American if they feel economically secure, and the answer will likely be a resounding no. Whether it's fear of job loss, skyrocketing healthcare costs, or the erosion of social safety nets, the middle class is living in a state of constant financial anxiety. And what do people do when they feel uncertain? Well, they stop spending. That hold onto their money, not out of choice, but out of sheer necessity, further slowing its movement through the economy. Precautionary saving becomes a survival instinct, turning money into a stagnant pool rather than a dynamic force. Number six, the myth of trickle down economics. For decades, policymakers have promised that tax cuts for the wealthy and deregulation would lead to greater investments in businesses, job creation, and economic expansion. But instead of wealth trickling down, it has pulled at the top, creating an economy where money moves within elite financial circles rather than through the broader population. The reality is that lower tax burdens on the wealthy have not led to reinvestment in productive industries or higher wages. They have led to capital hoarding, exacerbating the very economic stagnation they were supposed to prevent. Part 3: Why the decline in money velocity is a dire warning. Economic systems, much like galaxies, are shaped by both the visible forces and those that remain unseen. They expand, contract, and evolve according to patterns that, while sometimes imperceptible in the moment, tell a story of where a civilization is heading. When money moves freely through an economy, it fuels everything: innovation, social mobility, political stability. It allows families to spend, businesses to grow, and entire nations to thrive. But when money stagnates, when it becomes trapped in the coffers of a few rather than circulating among the many, it signals something deeper, something broken. The decline in money velocity is not just a dry economic indicator. It is the slow, steady loss of economic momentum, the weakening pulse of a system that is no longer self sustaining. The American economy is increasingly dependent on financial manipulation rather than organic growth, a structure built on asset bubbles, corporate stock buybacks, and a cycle where the rich get richer not by creating, but by accumulating. If this trend continues, the trajectory is not hard to predict. A fragile middle class, increasingly dependent on debt, government assistance, and an economy that no longer works for them. A society where the wealth gap isn't just an abstract figure, but a livid reality, a stark division between those who can afford to take risk and those who can't afford to live without one paycheck. But the most dangerous consequence of all, the gradual replacement of democracy with centralized economic control. It rarely happens overnight. Instead, it happens under the guise of stability. When people become so financially insecure, so exhausted from the struggle, that they become willing to accept any solution that promises order, even if it means giving up fundamental freedoms. When economic participation declines, so does political participation. And when political participation fades, power concentrates in fewer hands. This is not conjecture, it is history. If the decline in money velocity is a symptom, then the disease is clear. It's an economy that has prioritized wealth storage over wealth circulation. Reversing this trend requires a fundamental shift away from the policies that inflate asset prices while leaving wages behind, away from speculative financial engineering, and toward an economy that actually moves. This means investment in real wages, education, and infrastructure rather than asset bubbles and stock buybacks. Stronger labor protections and policies that encourage economic participation, ensuring that work is rewarded with security and mobility, not just survival. And a tax system that incentivizes reinvestment in productive industries rather than wealth hoarding, redirecting capital into the hands of those who will spend it, innovate with it, and keep the economy alive. So, a healthy economy is not measured by how much wealth is concentrated at the top. It is measured by how dynamically money moves through the system, creating opportunities, sustaining businesses, and allowing entire communities to thrive. So, this is not just an abstract problem. It is a heartbeat that is slowing. An economy that was once fluid and expansive is becoming rigid and stagnant. And the question is not whether we have the resources to change it, because we do. The question is whether we have the will to. A healthy economy, like a healthy body, depends on circulation. Right now, the lifeblood of our economy is pooling in the places it was never meant to stay. The system is gasping for movement, for dynamism, for something to break the cycle of accumulation with distribution. The question before us is simple. Do we revive the system or do we stand idly by and watch it fade into history? Because history does not wait for those who hesitate, and neither does economic collapse. Part 4: The Vanishing Middle Class and the Decline of Relative Middle Class Household Income, or RMHI. The middle class was never just an income bracket, it was a promise. There was a time in America when the middle class wasn't just an economic category, it was a way of life. It was the expectation that hard work and dedication would be met with fair pay, home ownership, a stable retirement, and a reasonable shot at something better for the next generation. It was the idea that the country's prosperity wasn't hoarded at the top, but circulated through cities, towns, and neighborhoods, creating a foundation of stability. But over the last few decades, this foundation has begun to crack. The decline of relative middle class household income, or RMHI, is one of the clearest indicators of this shift. RMHI isn't just a raw dollar amount, it measures how middle income households are faring relative to the overall economy. So, in simpler terms, it tells us whether the middle class is keeping pace with economic growth or slowly being left behind. And the data is clear. Year after year, RMHI has declined, signaling an uncomfortable truth. While GDP, stock markets, and corporate profits have soared, the typical American family has struggled to keep up. And this isn't just about individual hardship. Historically, when a nation's middle class shrinks, the consequences ripple across society. Economic stagnation turns into political instability. Populism surges, and the very structures that once seemed unshakable, governments, institutions, social contracts begin to erode. And the fall of RMHI isn't a footnote in an economics textbook. It is a warning flare for what happens when prosperity stops being shared. For decades, American workers have been promised that if they played by the rules, they'd be rewarded. They were told as productivity increased, wages would rise in tandem. That as technology advanced, new opportunities would replace the old ones. That free markets, if left to their own devices, would naturally lift all boats. But for many, those promises have rung hollow. Wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely budged in over 40 years. Productivity has continued its relentless climb, but the profits generated have been siphoned upwards, fueling record executive salaries and skyrocketing stock valuations rather than boosting the paychecks of the people actually doing the work. Meanwhile, the cost of nearly everything essential, housing, healthcare, education, has outpaced wage growth, squeezing middle class families from all sides. Globalization only accelerated this divide. As corporations chased lower labor costs overseas, the industries that had once served as pillars of middle class stability, like manufacturing, textiles, even parts of the service sector, began to disappear. Jobs that had once supported families, provided benefits, and ensured retirement security were replaced by precarious, low wage alternatives. And the American economy didn't stop growing, but it grew in a way that concentrated wealth at the top and left the middle class fighting for scraps. Technology, too, has played its part. Automation, artificial intelligence, and the digitization of entire industries have reshaped the workforce, often at the expense of those without specialized skills. The factory worker, the office administrator, the skilled tradesman, many have found themselves competing not just with overseas labor, but with machines that don't need breaks, wages, or healthcare. The promise that new technology would create just as many jobs as they destroyed has not materialized as evenly as its champions once claimed. Instead, the opportunities that have emerged tend to require advanced education and niche expertise, leaving behind those who lack access to high level training. Yet, perhaps, nothing has done more damage to the middle class than the slow, deliberate weakening of organized labor. For much of the 20th century, unions acted as powerful counterweights to corporate interests, securing better wages, benefits, and job protections for workers. But since the 1980s, union membership has plummeted. Without collective bargaining power, workers have been left to negotiate with multinational corporations on their own, an impossible task when the balance of power is so lopsided. The result? Wages have remained stagnant. Job security has eroded, and benefits that were once standard have become luxuries available only to a shrinking few. At the same time, the tax and policy landscape has tilted even further in favor of the wealthy. Decades of tax cuts, deregulation, and pro corporate policies have ensured that those who already control vast amounts of capital get to keep more of it, while working and middle class Americans shoulder an increasing share of the tax burden. Capital gains, earned primarily by those at the top, are taxed at lower rates than wages, further widening the wealth gap. The rich don't just earn more, they accumulate wealth in ways that allow them to stay ahead permanently, while middle class families find themselves treading water. The erosion of social mobility is perhaps the most damning indictment of all. For generations, America was defined by the idea that anyone, regardless of where they started, could rise through hard work and perseverance. But today, upward mobility is increasingly an illusion. The cost of higher education have ballooned, saddling young people with debt before they even enter the workforce. Home ownership, once the cornerstone of middle class wealth, has become increasingly out of reach for younger generations. The wealthiest Americans aren't just staying rich, they are consolidating their economic power, passing it down through generations, creating an entrenched aristocracy in what was once supposed to be the land of opportunity. A declining middle class isn't just an economic issue, it's a social and political crisis waiting to explode. When people feel financially secure, they invest in their communities, support democratic institutions, and trust that the system, while imperfect, ultimately works in their favor. But when financial anxiety becomes the default state, trust erodes. People lose faith in their leaders. They turn against institutions and become susceptible to the lure of demagogues who promise to burn it all down and rebuild something new, no matter how reckless the plan may be. This is not a theoretical warning. History is full of examples where economic inequalities fueled political upheaval, from the fall of the Roman Republic to the revolutions that reshaped Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. Even in modern democracies, rising inequality has coincided with growing political polarization, social unrest, and the erosion of democratic norms. The decline of RMHI is not just about money, it's about power. It's about who gets to decide the future of the country, who has a voice in shaping policy, and who is left to navigate an increasingly unforgiving system on their own. If the middle class continues to shrink, the consequences will be far reaching, extending far beyond economics into the very fabric of American society. The question we now face is whether we will allow this trend to continue or whether we will take the steps necessary to rebuild the economic backbone of the nation. The solution is not nostalgia for the past, but action for the future, rebalancing policies, investing in workers, and ensuring that prosperity is not something reserved for a select few, but something that moves through the economy lifting everyone along the way. But if the middle class disappears, it won't just be an economic shift, it will be the end of the American promise as we once knew it. Part 6: The Middle Class and Decline and Lessons from History. The collapse of a middle class is never just an economic event. It is a societal transformation, one that sends ripple effects through politics, culture, and governance. Across history, civilizations that allowed wealth to pull at the top while the economic foundation eroded found themselves on a familiar path. Discontent, instability, and in many cases, a fundamental shift in power structures. The United States is not the first nation to face this crisis. The question is whether we will learn from history or repeat it. Long before the United States became the economic powerhouse, another great republic dominated the world: Rome. The Roman Republic was built on the backs of middle class farmers, soldiers, men who owned land, paid taxes, and fought in its wars. But as wealth accumulated in the hands of an elite ruling class, small landholders were pushed out, their farms absorbed into massive estates owned by Rome's ultra wealthy. And with no economic stability, the once independent middle class was reduced to a mass of unemployed citizens dependent on government handouts. Political strife followed. With the Republic no longer representing its people, civil unrest spread, leading to the rise of demagogues, populist uprisings, and ultimately authoritarian rule under the emperors. Rome's democracy didn't fall overnight. It rotted from within as its middle class crumbled beneath the weight of economic inequality. The 1920s roared with prosperity, but it was a gilded illusion. Beneath the surface, economic imbalances were festering. Corporate profits soared while wages remained stagnant. Wealth was increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, and speculation ran wild in financial markets. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it wiped out millions of middle class jobs and sent the economy into free fall. With entire communities devastated, populist movements surged across the political spectrum. Some called for radical economic reform, while others gravitated toward authoritarian figures promising stability through force. The crisis demanded government intervention, leading to FDR's New Deal, which rebuilt the middle class through public works programs, labor protections, and the creation of Social Security, a recognition that without a stable economic foundation, democracy itself was at risk. Long before the 2008 financial crash, there was the Gilded Age, a period when industrial giants like Rockefeller and Carnegie amassed fortunes so vast that they effectively controlled much of the US economy. Meanwhile, factory workers toiled under brutal conditions, barely earning enough to survive. The inequality was so extreme that it sparked waves of labor strikes, populist uprisings, and violent clashes between workers and the elite. The backlash gave birth to the Progressive Era, which saw labor laws, antitrust regulations, and social reforms aimed at restoring economic balance. Left unchecked, wealth concentration threatened to destabilize the country entirely, but reformers pushed back just in time to prevent it from spiraling out of control. If there was ever a golden age for the middle class, it was the post World War II era. Veterans returned home to well paying jobs, government backed home loans, and higher education funded by the GI Bill. Labor unions were strong. Progressive tax policies ensured wealth was reinvested into infrastructure and social programs, and American industry thrived. But starting in the 1970s, things began to unravel. Deregulation, tax cuts favoring the wealthy, and the decline of unions reversed many of those gains. By the time globalization, automation, and financialization took full hold in the 21st century, the American middle class was no longer rising. It was treading water, trying to stay afloat in an economy that increasingly favored the few at the expense of the many. History tells us what happens when the economic backbone of a society erodes. If ignored, the result is rarely a gentle decline. It is upheaval, instability, and often a radical reshaping of governance itself. Part 7. What happens when the middle class collapses? The decline of the middle class is not just about economics, it is about power. A healthy middle class acts as a stabilizing force. It keeps wealth from concentrating too tightly at the top and prevents widespread poverty from destabilizing society at the bottom. When that balance disappears, history has shown time and again what follows. As wealth concentrates in fewer hands, political polarization increases. Trust in government erodes. Populist leaders on both the left and the right gain momentum by channeling economic frustration into anger toward the system. Some advocate for radical redistribution of wealth. Others promise stability through nationalism, protectionism, and authoritarian control. We are already seeing these fractures today. Political extremism is no longer fringe, it is mainstream. Disillusionment with the institutions is rising. Social trust is crumbling. And when people feel economically powerless, they don't turn to policy debates. They turn to strongmen, revolutionaries, or conspiracy theories. The middle class isn't just an economic category, it's the foundation of democracy. And right now, that foundation is cracking. Part 8. The future. What happens when AI and automation reshape governance? The shrinking of the middle class isn't just an American problem, it is a global phenomenon. Across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, advanced economies are experiencing similar shifts. Automation, multinational corporate dominance, and wage stagnation are reshaping labor markets, creating more wealth at the top, but fewer stable middle class jobs. But the next chapter of this transformation may be unlike anything history has ever seen before. As economic inequality grows, governments are turning to artificial intelligence and machine learning to manage societal challenges. In countries like China, AI driven surveillance and social credit systems are already being used to monitor and influence public behavior. In the West, AI is increasingly used in everything from predictive policing to automated welfare decisions. As middle class economic security declines, will democratic governments use AI to optimize governance? Or will they use it to consolidate control, replacing elected officials with algorithmic decision makers who serve corporate and elite interests? If democracy is defined by economic participation, then a world with a weak middle class is one where democracy itself is at risk. The next battle for governance may not be between political ideologies, but between human led government and AI driven administration. So, who knows why the middle class is shrinking? Well, for decades, some of the most brilliant economic minds have been sounding the alarm about the collapse of the middle class. They published books, given speeches, and laid out the evidence in meticulous detail. Yet, despite all the research, despite the stark data, despite the growing frustration of millions of people, the issue remains largely ignored in mainstream political discourse. It's not for a lack of knowledge. French economist Thomas Piketty shook the economic world with Capital in the 21st Century, demonstrating how wealth inevitably accumulates at the top unless governments actively redistribute it. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz has written extensively on how inequality erodes democracy itself. Institutions like the Pew Research Center, the Brookings Institution, and Economic Policy Institute have meticulously documented the trend. Middle class incomes have stagnated since the 1970s, while the wealthiest Americans have grown exponentially richer. The data is overwhelming. The warning signs are flashing. So, why does it feel like nobody in power is talking about it? The truth is, talking about the collapse of the middle class is inconvenient. It requires acknowledging hard systemic failures, ones that aren't easily condensed into a soundbite or a political slogan. Tackling these crises means diving into complex, dry sounding topics like tax policy, trade agreements, labor laws, and monetary policy. None of these are as emotionally charged as debates over immigration, gun rights, and gender identity, so politicians, eager to secure votes, pivot toward culture wars instead. It's also no secret that modern politics runs on money, and many of the most powerful political donors benefit from the decline of the middle class. Wall Street, multinational corporations, and Silicon Valley giants thrive in an economy where wages remain low, labor protections are weak, and wealth continues to funnel upward. The people funding political campaigns are not middle class workers struggling to keep up with rent. They are CEOs, hedge fund managers, and billionaires whose interests are directly opposed to reversing these economic trends. Then there's the media, the corporate owned press, dependent on advertising dollars and high engagement, has every incentive to focus on divisive cultural flashpoints rather than deep structural issues. A headline about a celebrity scandal or a viral Twitter fight generates far more clicks than a report on stagnant wages or the long term consequences of corporate tax breaks. The public, bombarded with daily distractions, rarely hears the full scope of the crisis unfolding beneath them. The silence isn't accidental, it's the byproduct of a political and media system designed to keep people distracted from the real levers of power. The US isn't alone in this crisis. Across the world, middle class stability is unraveling. In Europe, once the stronghold of social democracy, middle class workers are feeling the squeeze. Wage stagnation, automation, and rising living costs have fueled populist movements on both the left and right, with growing resentment toward elites who seem insulated from the struggles of ordinary citizens. The rise of nationalist parties in the UK, Germany, and France is, in part, a response to this economic frustration. In China, the government once celebrated the emergence of a vast middle class as proof of the country's economic miracle. But as growth slows and crackdowns on private enterprise increase, the future of this middle class looks increasingly fragile. The Chinese Communist Party's efforts to maintain control over economic forces may end up sacrificing the very stability they once sought to protect. Japan, once the model of middle class prosperity, has been battling wage stagnation and economic stagnation for decades. An aging population, declining birth rates, and a culture of overwork have created a generation of workers who feel financially insecure despite Japan's overall wealth. In Latin America, middle class households have long struggled with economic volatility. Inflation, job insecurity, and political corruption have made social mobility an increasingly unattainable goal. Governments trapped between appeasing elites and maintaining public stability often fail to implement reforms that could create long term prosperity. No matter where you look, the trend is clear. The middle class is shrinking, and the consequences are profound. So, could this crisis end the American way of life? Well, throughout history, the strength of a country's middle class has determined its political stability. When people have economic security, they invest in their communities, participate in elections, and trust in democratic institutions. When they feel financially powerless, that trust deteriorates. As we discussed before, economic anxiety is a powerful force. It breeds populism, extremism, and political volatility. If the middle class continues to erode, American democracy itself could be at risk. Historically, when economic despair deepens, people become more willing to embrace authoritarian solutions. A strong leader who promises to fix everything, even if it means dismantling democratic norms, like the Constitution. We've seen this before: the rise of interwar Germany, modern day Hungary, and Venezuela's economic collapse all followed periods of middle class destruction and rising inequality. The pattern is chillingly familiar. The erosion of the middle class isn't just about money, it's about the survival of democratic governance. So, what might actually replace American democracy if we do nothing? Well, if traditional democracy becomes unworkable, what comes next? Several alternative government models could emerge, each with different probabilities. First, we have technocratic governance, a rule by experts and AI. So, with public trust in politicians at a historic low, some believe decision making could shift to technocrats, scientists, and AI driven systems. Instead of elections, policies would be set by data and algorithms, optimizing governance for efficiency rather than public sentiment. China's social credit system offers a glimpse of this future, a state where AI monitors behaviors and rewards or punishes citizens accordingly. While the US would likely never embrace such an overt system, predictive policing, algorithmic welfare programs, and AI driven decision making are already creeping into governance. Would people accept a rule by machines if it meant economic stability? Well, some might. Then there's corporate governance, the rule of billionaires. So if money already controls politics, why not just remove the middleman? In this model, governments take a back seat as corporations wield direct power over policy. Tech companies already control vast amounts of data, infrastructure, and even security. Amazon, Google, and Meta already influence elections, police digital speech, and shape global policies. Could they one day replace the role of elected officials altogether? And something many of us are afraid of is authoritarian democracy, elections that just don't matter. So imagine a likely scenario here, much like the Russian style model, where elections still happen, but power remains concentrated in an elite ruling class. Political opposition is crushed, media is tightly controlled, and dissent is punished. But the illusion of democracy is maintained. Then there's decentralized governance, the blockchain revolution. I know you crypto bros are excited about this one, but a more radical alternative is decentralized governance, where traditional governments lose power to blockchain based decision making. In this world, governance is run by digital communities, direct voting, and smart contracts instead of national governments. It's a fascinating concept, but so far it remains mostly theoretical. So, is AI already ushering in a new political order? Well, AI is already influencing governance in subtle but powerful ways. Predictive policing, automated public services, and smart cities are redefining the role of human policymakers. The question isn't whether AI will shape governance, the question is how much control we're willing to give it. If we let AI make decisions, do we sacrifice human accountability? If AI optimizes policies based purely on data, do we lose the soul of democracy? The rise of AI driven governance is no longer science fiction, it's happening right now. And if the middle class continues to shrink, people may embrace AI rule simply because it seems like a more functional alternative to broken democracy. So, where does this all lead us? Well, we're standing at a crossroads. The decline of the middle class is not just an economic issue, it is the battle for the future of democracy itself. History warns us of what happens when inequality spirals out of control. The only question now is, will we learn from it? Because if we don't, the America we know may not exist for much longer. Thank you for listening to the Gray Files podcast. If you would like to learn more about this and see economic charts on RMHI or the velocity of money, you can go to my website at ericabarker.ai. That's ERIKA, B as in Bravo, ARKER.ai. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay curious.